we go. Whoa, terrible production value, but this is the cardiac cycle review. Again, it's a review, which means you know what you're talking about, but let's just talk about it again so you get more familiar with the terms and such. Again, I'm using a chart right here that I created just for the sake of trying to be able to put the entire story on one big block right here with 8 columns. Each column represents a tenth of a second because one cardiac cycle is approximately 0.8 seconds. That's assuming that the person has a heart rate of about 75 beats per minute. That's 75 beats per 60 seconds, and that comes out to be 0.8 seconds per beat. First off, cardiac cycle, as you can see off the graffiti page right here, disappearing at the top. Remember that S stands for systole, and systole refers to the contracting of a heart chamber, also the pumping of the blood because of the contracting. A D here represents diastole, and that means the relaxing of the heart chamber, and that's going to correspond to the filling of that chamber with blood. We said we've got 8 columns right here representing the 8 tenths of a second for one cardiac cycle, but each row represents a different part of the heart. So the top row is the atria of the heart. The second row is the AV valve, which leads to the ventricles of the heart, which is then followed by the semilunar valve. And remember, Vava said that veins go into atria, atria go into the ventricle, and the ventricle goes into the artery. So later we're going to include the veins up here and the artery down here. First thing we do is put the systoles in their proper place. So we'll put an S right here in the atrium and a D down here for the ventricle, but then SSS right here for the ventricle. So atrial systole happens in that first tenth of a second. All these are approximate numbers. Then it's over and it stays in diastole the rest of the time. However, when the atrium's in systole, the ventricle's in diastole. When the atrium is finished with systole, then the ventricle gets the signal and it goes into systole for approximately 3 times longer than what the atrium did. But after the ventricle is finished with its systole, it goes into diastole. And remember, in diastole, the heart chamber is relaxing and the walls are expanding. So the pressure inside is going to be near 0. That's particularly important down here because the expanding ventricular chamber doesn't really offer any resistance to the blood that's going to fall down from the top. Okay. Next thing right here, the closing of the AV valve happens between atrial systole and ventricular systole, or you could say it happens at the beginning of ventricular systole because it's this pressure that causes that valve to slam shut, and that is the S1 noise. Now the S2 noise right here is the semilunar valve slamming shut, and that happens after ventricular systole. And we'll talk about what's called afterload and how the afterload in the artery caused that valve to slam shut. So there's the systoles and the diastoles, and you can quickly make a comparison between the length of atrial systole and ventricular systole, atrial diastole and ventricular diastole. And again, notice during half the cardiac cycle, both chambers are completely at rest. Also notice neither the atrium or the ventricle is in systole while the other is in systole. Okay, next thing right here, we mentioned that the valves open and close. Well, with the AV valve right here, when the atrium's in systole, there's a higher pressure here than there is inside the ventricle because the ventricle's at 0 because the walls are expanding. So that little bitty push right there from the atrium, of course, ensures that the AV valve will be open and it will go from higher pressure to lower pressure. Blood squirts down here. Not much, by the way, only about 15-20% of the total blood volume that gets into the ventricle is pushed in during this time. The rest of it came in during this time right here. So this is where most of the blood that gets into the ventricle gets into the ventricle during this period of time right here. Now, when the atrium relaxes and goes into diastole and the ventricle goes into systole, then the pressure in the ventricle will become greater than 0. Greater than the pressure inside the atrium, and the blood will try to go backwards. However, the AV valve, whether it's right or left, won't let that happen, and the AV valve will slam shut. Again, that's your S1 noise. As long as the ventricle has a higher pressure in it than the atrium, the AV valves will stay shut. But when the ventricle goes into diastole and the pressure goes down to 0, the small pressure in the atrium, even though it is very small, will be greater than 0. It will push down on the AV valve, and the AV valve will open. And from that point, for the next, say, 4/10 of a second, just this back pressure, venous blood pressure, will cause that valve to stay open. Okay, so again, when the AV valve opens, blood falls through to the ventricle. It's not really much of a push there at all. It's just falling inside. Next thing right here, let's take a look at, same thing. Whoops, sorry, camera wiggling. Same thing, but now we're just going to decorate it up a little bit more, because now we're putting in the ideas about, well, in diastolic volume. Sorry, there's a wind out here. Stop it. Okay. In diastolic volume, that's the amount of blood that gets into the ventricle. The wind is still blowing. It's the amount of blood that gets into the ventricle during diastole, and that little bitty squirt right there, which is systole. So end diastolic volume. So the maximum amount of blood that got inside the ventricle by the end of diastole, ventricular diastole. Now on the other side of ventricular systole is ESV, which is end systolic volume. And the end systolic volume represents the amount of blood that's left inside the ventricle after ventricular systole. So you had a lot of blood inside here, then you squeeze a lot of it out, that's called the stroke volume. Then what's left behind, what you weren't able to get out, is called the end systolic volume. And a quick little formula for figuring out what the stroke volume is: end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume gives you the stroke volume. So the difference between what you had to begin with and what was left behind is what got outside the door. And by the way, this amount right here is approximately 70 milliliters per beat for the cartoon person we're talking about here. So it's called stroke volume. And the time in which the semilunar valves were open and the stroke volume is coming out is called the ejection period. Now, the ejection period only occurs when the pressure inside the ventricle is greater than the pressure in the arteries out here. So the ventricle went from 0 right here to approximately 80, which will pop open the valve. It goes up to a max of about 120, but then when it begins to relax, it goes back down to 0. So this opening and closing has to do with the pressure created inside the ventricle compared to the pressure in the artery. Again, in this first moment right here, it didn't automatically open the semilunar valve. It had to go from 0 to whatever the minimum pressure was inside the artery. There is a moment of time right here, by the way, in which the AV valve and the semilunar valve are both closed. And that's called isovolumetric contraction. What's really good about that is it creates a hydraulic situation in which the pressure inside the lumen of the ventricle can go up exponentially. If either one of these valves is incompetent, then that spike in pressure isn't possible. So the cardiac muscle isn't capable on its own of creating this high pressure of about 120. It has to have this isovolumetric contraction period in which both valves are closed. So very significant that the valves be competent and that be closed at the proper time. Okay, skipping on down to the bottom here. Ouch. Still on the graffiti page, but now let's look a little more closely at filling this thing out. Well, here's the blood pressure of the venous blood coming into the atrium right here, and it's just above 0, so it's barely falling in. Remember, there is no valve between the vein and the atrium, so the door is always open. But on the other side right here, the artery has back pressure to it. It's called afterload. And that afterload was created by the last pulse or surge of blood from the left ventricle. This stroke volume right here at 120 units of pressure pressurized the artery. Then when the ventricle relaxed and the pressure went down to 0, the pressure inside the artery was still at 120. The blood tried to go from high pressure to low pressure, and the semilunar valve would not let it happen. So the valve slammed shut, and there's your second heart sound. Now, this pressure is going to drop as the blood drains away from the heart through the arteries, such as the aorta on the left side. And so the pressure drops down from 120, 115, 110, 100. And then in the next cardiac cycle, it drops down to 90, then to 80, but by this time the ventricle has gone into a new systole. The pressure inside goes from 0 up to 80, then it pops open the semilunar valve, and here comes the blood out at that higher pressure, 120 units. This explains why your arterial blood pressure, at least systemic arterial blood pressure, is listed as 120/80. It is the best the left ventricle could do and how low the artery's pressure went until the next surge of blood. The 120 is called the systolic pressure, and the 80 is called the diastolic pressure. Let me flip a page right here real quick. Now, see if there's anything left on the other side. And there sort of kind of is. Finishing this thing off, the cardiac cycle review. Up here we have the ECG, in which we have the P wave, the QRS, and there's the T wave, and there's the next P wave. Now, of course, that is a very bad representation of what an ECG really looks like. However, you get the idea. The P wave precedes atrial depolarization. The QRS precedes ventricular depolarization. And again, we notice again where systoles are for the atria and for the ventricles. We notice where the heart sounds are. We threw in the word here preload to represent the amount of blood and pressure inside the ventricle, which, by the way, it's the same thing as the EDV, the end diastolic volume. Here's the idea of afterload, the pressure inside the artery that's pushing back against the semilunar valve, causing it to shut here and stay shut until the next surge of blood. Remember, that surge of blood is during the ejection period, and it represents the pulse that you would recognize later on. Here's another idea just to sort of put it all together. Here's a cartoon of what we just said. First, the two atria contract, atrial systole, while the ventricles in diastole, pushing the last bit of blood down into the ventricles. In the next moment, the atria relax, go into diastole. Then the ventricles go into systole and push the blood through the semilunar valves, through the arteries, into the body. Then the atria remain relaxed, the ventricles now relax, and the blood falls through the atria down into the ventricle. Next moment of time, they're all still relaxed and the blood falls down. And the next moment of time, the atria will contract, then the ventricles will contract, and then everybody will relax and everybody will relax. You can take this idea right here and match it against the chart to see how it works out. It's probably a good place to stop.